They say a home doesn't just hold your memories, it holds your breath, your quiet victories, your grief. Mine sat nestled against a sloping ridge near the southern boundary of Hollow Creek Estates, a modest cabin-style house that I had built with my own hands after retiring from the Army Corps of Engineers. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Cedar siding, a red metal roof, 2 porches where I drank coffee and watched deer wander through the pines. Peaceful. Tucked away. Paid off. And that morning, I watched it die. It started with a low rumble, so faint, I thought it was a thunderclap. But when I opened my eyes and sat up in the guest bedroom I was temporarily sleeping in my original home, was under light renovation, I heard the unmistakable grind of machinery. I hurried outside barefoot, heart racing. That's when I saw it. An orange Case excavator was parked halfway up my gravel driveway. Its steel arm extended toward my cabin like a monster's claw. 2 men in reflective vests stood nearby. One of them held a clipboard. The other climbed into the machine. "Hey," I shouted, sprinting forward. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Neither of them flinched. The engine roared to life. My voice was swallowed by the hydraulic screech of the boom lifting. Then crack! The bucket slammed into the front porch. Timber exploded outward like shrapnel. My rocking chair, my wife's favorite chair, the one she used to sit in with a blanket and a book, was crushed to splinters in seconds. I ran forward, only to be blocked by the man with the clipboard. "You need to step back, sir. This structure has been ordered for removal by the Hollow Creek HOA. "What removal? This is my property. You're trespassing. The structure violates Section 3.11 of the Neighborhood Harmony Covenant. Unauthorized accessory dwelling. Per the HOA board vote, it must be cleared." "Cleared!" My voice broke. "You think you can just tear down my house without even talking to me? I own this land, every foot of it." The second slam came as I screamed. The porch roof caved in. One of the windows shattered. Saw it. Inside, I could still see the edge of my old oak desk. My wife's silver frame photo. A quilt her mother had made. Gone in an instant, buried under the boom of unearned authority. I don't remember what I screamed after that. I only remember the rawness in my throat, the burn in my chest, the surreal sensation of watching my life be crushed under steel and rubber treads while I stood there helpless barefoot on the cold gravel. The man with the clipboard walked away talking into a radio. The excavator didn't stop. By the time the sheriff's deputy arrived, almost 40 minutes later, my home was half rubble, half ruin. The excavator finally shut off when the radio squawked something about civil liability. But the damage was done. Roof collapsed. Walls caved. Porch obliterated. My tools, my books, my wife's journals crushed under bureaucratic arrogance. The deputy walked over, hat in hand. His name was Kyle. Young, sweaty, uneasy. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lawson. I thought this was all cleared legally through the HOA. "It wasn't," I said flatly. "And you're going to write that down in your report." He gave me a tired look. "I'll have to check the records." "You do that. And when you find nothing, I expect you to open an investigation." Kyle shifted uncomfortable. "It might be more of a civil matter, sir." I stared at him for a long time. "You know my son works for the Federal Land Office, right?" He blinked. "I know, sir." "Well, he does. And you just allowed a private organization to demolish a residence that may sit partially on federally protected terrain. Congratulations." He straightened slightly. "I'll make sure to include that in the report." I turned away. My knees buckled as I knelt down beside the wreckage. A half-burned photo album peeked out from a broken frame. I reached for it, fingers trembling. Page after page had been torn, soaked, ruined. My wife's smile stared back at me through water damage and ash. That night, I slept in the back of my pickup truck. The air smelled like wood dust and oil. I watched the stars and felt nothing. Just numbness, rage stored in bone. They thought I'd go quietly. That they could cite some fabricated line in a covenant and destroy what I built without consequence. That I was just another old man with no fight left in him. But they forgot something crucial. I'd buried a wife. I'd served 3 tours overseas. And my son. He didn't just work for the Bureau of Land Management. He ran the regional office. And he owed me a favor. The next morning, I sat on the hood of my truck with a thermos of bitter coffee and a pen in my hand. A notepad rested on my knee, mostly blank, except for the words I kept scribbling and crossing out. Illegal demolition. No notice. Land ownership. None of it felt real yet. Not the heap of splintered wood that used to be my home. Not the silence of the neighbors who had seen it and said nothing, and certainly not the flimsy explanation I'd gotten from that clipboard thug. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I just sat and stared and thought. If they had sent a letter, if I had ignored it or failed to respond, or if it were legally valid, maybe part of me could have swallowed this. But they hadn't. There was no letter, no email, no citation posted on the door, not a single communication in writing. Just a machine sent to crush everything I loved. I had dealt with bureaucracies before. I knew how they worked. You couldn't just knock someone's home down without a trail, no matter how much the HOA believed it was judge and jury. I took a deep breath, stood up, and grabbed a small plastic bin I'd stored under the tarp in my truck bed. Inside were files, receipts, tax statements, and copies of my original land survey, the one I'd paid for myself when I bought this property 15 years ago. The cabin had been inspected, permitted, and grandfathered in under older zoning laws that predated the HOA's current guidelines. I knew because I'd checked, twice. They didn't care about legality, they cared about power. I went to the HOA office first. It was in the community center, a big beige building at the edge of the neighborhood, with a smiling bronze plaque that read Hollow Creek Estates Preserving Beauty and Order. I nearly spit on it. The receptionist, a tight-smiled woman in her 50s named Marlene, looked up when I entered. "Oh, Mr. Lawson, I need to speak with your president, now." She hesitated, fingers hovering over the intercom. "Mr. Tibbs is in a board meeting." Then interrupt him. "Tell him it's about the house he demolished yesterday." Her jaw tightened. I'm not leaving until he answers for it. And if you'd like the federal land office to audit every document in this place, you'll push that little button and get him here, now." Her finger moved, a soft buzz. A door opened to the left moments later, and out walked Ronald Tibbs, head of the HOA. Tan suit, full head of silver hair, smug as a weathered politician. He moved like he was used to applause. I hated him on sight. Mr. Lawson, I expected you'd be upset." "Upset," I repeated, stepping forward. "You sent a goddamn excavator to destroy my home." He didn't flinch. Accessory structures are governed by Section 3.11 of our Community Harmony Covenant. The board voted unanimously to remove the dwelling, which was found to be non-compliant and unapproved. "Show me the letter, the one you supposedly sent. The citation, the notice, anything. Show me proof that you followed proper procedure." Tibbs gave a tired sigh. "Unfortunately, our file system is still being updated. I assure you the vote was recorded and archived. We don't need to notify in writing for violations that have been documented on multiple drive-bys. Drive-bys aren't law. And your authority ends where mine begins. That cabin was on my land, and it was legal." He raised an eyebrow. I leaned in, eyes locked. "You made a mistake." He smiled. "Then take it up with your lawyer." "I will," I said. "But first I'll take it up with my son." "Your son?" "Stephen Lawson, Regional Director, Bureau of Land Management." His expression didn't change at first, but I saw the micro shift in his eyes. The brief flicker of calculation. "You're bluffing." I pulled out my phone, brought up a photo of me and Stephen standing in front of a federal BLM sign. I showed it to him. "You sure?" He looked. And I knew in that second he wasn't sure of anything anymore. "I'll be back," I said quietly. "With records. With maps. With federal codes. And if I find 1 inch of your beautification project spilling over into protected land, I'll see to it that you're bulldozing your own office next." I walked out. My hands were shaking when I got back to my truck, but not from fear, from control, from purpose, from the deep, silent understanding that the tide had started to turn. I went home, not to the house, which now looked like a war zone, but to the edge of the property where I still had cell reception. I called Stephen. "Hey, Dad, you okay?" "No," I said. "They tore it down." He was quiet for a moment. "The cabin, everything. Claimed it violated HOA codes. Didn't even send a letter. I'll be there Friday. I don't want you to get in trouble." "I won't, but they might." I hung up and looked across the land. A hawk circled overhead, crying into the wind. I felt something crackle inside me, not anger anymore. Resolve. They thought they'd broken me. But all they'd done was wake something I hadn't used in years. A soldier's instinct, a father's fury, and a veteran's patience for planning every step until the enemy exposes their weakest flank. The days that followed were a blur of sawdust, ash, and silence. I spent most of my time sorting through what little remained in the wreckage sheets of warped, tin-splintered wood panels and half-buried memories. Every time I picked up a broken item, I saw my wife's hands on it, her handwriting on an old recipe card, her lipstick mark on a coffee mug, Her garden tools rusted from that one summer she planted lavender by the porch. But I didn't have the luxury of mourning, not yet. I had work to do. What chilled me more than the destruction itself was the precision. The excavator hadn't touched the main road or the mailbox. The work crew had stopped just short of the boundary line, like someone had studied it beforehand, measured it, targeted it. They knew exactly what they were doing. And the worst part, it wasn't personal, at least not at first. I wasn't the only one. I began walking the neighborhood late at night, taking the long route through the trails behind the home's flashlight tucked low. There were signs, if you knew where to look, backyards stripped bare. Old guest houses vanished, fencing removed and replaced with HOA standard hedges. The neighborhood was changing quietly, surgically. HOA beautification, they called it. But what it really was control. I stopped by a house on Elm Ridge that used to have a gazebo, a big white wooden one, where an elderly couple hosted Sunday tea. It was gone now, the grass still raw with tire marks. I knocked on their door. Mrs. Calloway answered. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Mr. Lawson. Oh dear. Did they take your gazebo? I asked. Her lips trembled. They said it violated community harmony and that it blocked drainage. She lowered her voice. Ronald Tibbs sent a letter, told us if we resisted, they'd fine us into foreclosure. You didn't fight it. Her hands shook. We tried. But no one wanted to speak out. Not after what happened to the Michaels. I frowned. What happened to them? They filed a complaint against the HOA last year. Next thing you know, their fence was cited for multiple violations. Then their roof shingles, then their dog's weight. They moved to Florida last month. I felt my chest tighten. This is bigger than a demolition. She nodded slowly. It's control by paperwork. They strangle you with violations until you fold. I thanked her, walked back to my truck, and sat in the dark with my arms crossed. This wasn't just about me. This HOA was executing a campaign, a methodical purge of anything they deemed non-compliant. But only selectively. Only against those who couldn't fight back. Except now I could. That night I opened the county's public zoning website and cross-referenced it with my own survey data. Then I compared it to BLM overlays. To the untrained eye, the lines meant nothing, colored grids, scattered numbers. But to me, they told a story. The edge of my property ran parallel to a designated protected utility corridor flagged under a 1978 federal order tied to wetland conservation. It was old, obscure, but it mattered. And while the HOA didn't realize it, the boundary of their beautification plan likely nudged over it. That was my lever. The next day, I drove to the county records office and requested a full copy of the HOA's filed plat maps and development permits. The clerk, a red-haired man in his 30s, seemed sympathetic. Honestly, Mr. Lawson, you're not the first to raise concerns, he said quietly as he slid the files across the counter. But the HOA board's got influence here. The last woman who challenged them, they tied her up in arbitration for 8 months. Thanks, I said. I won't need that long. I spent the afternoon poring over those documents, every lot line, every surveyor's note. That's when I spotted it. Page 14, Section C, a footnote about an expansion initiative into Parcel 18B, slated for landscape conversion. That parcel, according to my own overlays, sat squarely in the federally protected corridor. I called Stephen. You were right, I said. Send me everything. Already on the way. He paused. Dad, are you sure you're ready for this? I looked out across the ruined foundation of my cabin, the chimney still standing like a soldier left behind. They started it. His voice was calm. Then we'll finish it. That evening, I received an envelope slid under my windshield wiper. No return address, no stamp. Just one sentence on plain white paper. Back off or we come for the main house. My blood went cold. I scanned the driveway. Empty. The street was quiet. I looked up at the windows of the nearby home's shadows, blinds drawn. Someone was watching. But they'd made a mistake, because now it was personal. They'd declared war on the wrong man. And this time I wasn't alone. By the following morning, the fear had settled into something colder, denser resolve. The kind I hadn't felt since the military, back when we made decisions with maps spread across hoods of Humvees, and a second's hesitation could mean the difference between surviving and being buried in sand. I stood on my porch, or what was left of it, and stared at the crumpled letter again. Back off or we come for the main house. I had already buried a wife and rebuilt my life once. They thought I would fold because I was alone. But I had learned in war and in grief, silence is never surrender. Sometimes it's a war drum. And so I knocked. Door after door in Hollow Creek Estates, I knocked. Some residents opened immediately, others hesitated. Many peeked through curtains and never answered. But I kept going. Hi, I'm Tom Lawson. My cabin was demolished by the HOA 2 days ago. Most people winced when I said it. Some nodded with heavy hearts. Some averted their eyes. I'm not here to cause trouble, I told them. I'm here to tell the truth. And I think some of you are living in fear like I was. That's when the dam began to crack. An older couple named the Millers told me the HOA had forced them to remove their grapevines planted by their parents in the 60s. A widow named Jean confessed that the HOA threatened to fine her $1 and $200 a week for having a shed that didn't match the house's paint color. A young mother whispered that when she tried to install a wheelchair ramp for her son, the HOA blocked the contractor and cited her for violating uniform elevation design. None of them fought back. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. They were afraid of being harassed, fined, dragged into endless litigation. They had no leverage, but I did. I returned home and began compiling statements, photos, and notes. Every person who spoke up became part of a pattern, a case I could build. And once people realized they weren't alone, the tide shifted. Jean dropped off a stack of letters she'd received from the HOA over the years. One of them was signed by a board member no longer living in the neighborhood, a violation of the HOA's own bylaws. The Millers gave me a flash drive with video footage from their doorbell camera showing Ronald Tibbs himself inspecting their yard late at night without permission. I sent all of it to Stephen. He called me an hour later. "This is good," he said. "Really good. And you were right. Parcel 18B is definitely within a protected BLM corridor. I'm initiating a formal review." I leaned back in my chair, heart steady. What happens if they're found in violation? If they've encroached on federal land, he said we can fine them, file injunctions, even demand demolition of any illegal structures. But it'll have more teeth if it's paired with community testimony. "I've got that," I said. "And growing." Stephen paused. "They're going to retaliate." "I know." He sighed. "Dad, I've lived through worse." That afternoon, I received a visit. Not from the HOA, but from one of its board members, a man named Barry Knight. He was a big guy, former contractor, shaved head-tight jaw. He pulled up in a black SUV with tinted windows and walked up my driveway like he owned it. "I hear you've been knocking on doors," he said. "I have," I replied calmly. "You need to stop." I didn't answer. Barry stepped closer. "You think people want to hear you whine about your shack? You think you're some kind of hero because you got your son in the government?" I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You're scared." He laughed. "You don't know what you're playing with." "I know exactly what I'm playing with. Do you?" He leaned in nose inches from mine. "You've got a nice truck, Tom. Be a shame if something happened to it." I didn't blink, smile. He froze. I tapped the small black lens clipped to the inside of my jacket. "A body cam. Live streaming to a cloud. Say hi to the county sheriff," I added. "He'll be seeing this in about 15 minutes. Barry stepped back, his face tight. He looked around once, then walked off without another word. By sundown, I had uploaded the footage and submitted a complaint, but I wasn't done. I sent a copy to the local newspaper anonymously, along with a brief summary of the HOA's harassment tactics. I didn't expect them to run it immediately, but it was now part of the public record. The real blow came later that night. Stephen called again. "Dad, we just received satellite imagery that confirms the HOA's new trail extension crosses 200 feet into restricted watershed. Meaning they've committed federal environmental violations. I'm submitting the violation package to the U.S. Attorney's Office." I exhaled. A long, slow breath that tasted like long-awaited justice. "Do I need a lawyer?" I asked. "Maybe, but not yet. For now, just document everything. Keep gathering names, dates, photos. The more you give me, the harder it'll be for them to hide." "Got it." He hesitated. "You okay?" "I am now." That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was alive with clarity. I stood at the edge of what had been my home and stared up at the stars. The land was quiet again. No excavator, no threat. Just the whisper of wind through the pines. They had built a system meant to silence people like me, but I'd learned to speak louder than silence. And soon they would learn what happens when the wrong man gets pushed too far, especially when that man has the law, the truth, and the federal government on his side. When Stephen arrived that Friday, the gravel crunched under his boots like it always had when he was a boy. But this time, he wasn't just visiting for the holidays or to help me patch a roof. He stepped out of his truck in a gray BLM field jacket, clipboard in hand, federal ID clipped to his chest. He looked like his mother. Same eyes, same quiet way of taking in a scene before speaking. But the moment he turned to me, there was fire in his gaze. "Jesus, Dad," he whispered, walking toward what remained of the cabin. "They really did it." I nodded, watching him take it all in. The splintered siding, the crushed remains of our porch swing, the burned-out mattress frame lying like a twisted skeleton across the yard. "I told you," I said quietly. He knelt by a cracked foundation post, brushing the dirt away from a stake marker I'd put in 15 years ago. "This marker is still on record," he murmured. "County registered. This was your legal structure. It was within code when I built it." Stephen stood slowly, and this he waved toward the rubble was destroyed without a hearing, without notice, and without any formal violation from the county or the city. Not a damn thing. He nodded, jaw tightening. "Okay, then let's burn it all down. Properly." We got to work. Stephen had brought with him 2 binders full of federal documentation, regional BLM overlays, conservation land markers, archived boundary surveys. As he flipped through each page, I began to understand just how much power he wielded, not in a flashy way, but through process, through precision, through knowing. He explained that under federal statute 43 CFR, Part 2800, any unauthorized development that infringes on federally managed corridors, particularly those designated for environmental conservation, can be subject to removal fines, or in severe cases, criminal liability. And guess what parcel the HOA had recently landscaped for their community trail enhancement? Parcel 18B. Stephen showed me satellite overlays. Their new footpath lined with decorative lamps and branded signage had cut through more than 50 meters of protected land. "Did they pull permits for any of this?" he asked.
No.
"Did they file environmental impact assessments?" I just laughed. He tapped his pen on the table. "Then I'm initiating a formal notice of federal non-compliance. Tomorrow." That night we sat by a fire pit I'd rigged from a circle of salvaged stones. We drank from chipped mugs, not talking much at first. Just the sound of logs popping and the wind in the trees. "I know I haven't visited much," Stephen said. I looked at him. "You had your life, I had mine." He shook his head. "That's not an excuse. After Mom passed, I think we both shut down." I stared into the flames. "Maybe. But look where we are now." He nodded. "I never thought I'd be investigating a neighborhood HOA on behalf of my father." "They picked the wrong land to mess with," I said. He smiled faintly. "They picked the wrong veteran." We laughed quietly, but it wasn't lighthearted. It was the kind of laugh that keeps your bones from cracking. The next morning, Stephen returned to town and filed the official notice. Within 72 hours, the HOA was required to respond. Ronald Tibbs didn't waste time. He sent a furious letter to the BLM office, denying all wrongdoing and accusing outside agitators of disrupting the peace. Stephen forwarded me the response. "He's panicking," he wrote. "They didn't expect anyone to fight back, especially not through federal channels." The following week, inspectors arrived, 3 of them. Not from the county, not from the HOA, but from Washington. They wore blue windbreakers, carried surveying equipment, and walked silently through the trails, yards, and communal spaces like surgeons. The neighborhood watched from windows. Some people whispered. A few came out to shake my hand. One man, Harold Brennan, an old neighbor who used to avoid eye contact, clasped my arm firmly. "I'm glad you didn't let them scare you. You made the rest of us remember who we are." I didn't know what to say. In less than 5 days, the inspectors confirmed Stephen's findings. The trail project had entered restricted space. No permit, no authorization, no environmental clearance. The violation was clear and it was severe. Stephen called me from his office. "We're issuing an order of remediation. The HOA must remove all developments from federal land and submit to a full audit of their use of adjacent parcels. And if they don't," I asked, "we'll take them to court." That same night, a notice was tacked to the HOA clubhouse door. I watched Ronald Tibbs read it, his lips tightening. He looked across the street and saw me watching from my lawn chair. For once, he didn't smile. He turned and walked away. Later, Stephen sent me a final message before bed. "Now, this isn't over, Dad, but we just cracked their armor. I looked out at the moonlit rubble where my home had stood. They thought they could break me. Instead, they'd awakened the most dangerous kind of man, one who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. The official order from the Bureau of Land Management had the effect of a lightning strike across Hollow Creek estates. By the following Monday, rumors were flying faster than HOA memos. Words like federal violation, environmental damage, and criminal liability began to float in whispered conversations between mailboxes and over backyard fences. But I knew better than to celebrate. HOA boards don't back down easily, especially not men like Ronald Tibbs. They regroup, they dig in, and if they feel threatened, they do what snakes do best. They strike, which is why I didn't let up for a second. Stephen and I spent our evenings going through more than just BLM maps. We began compiling a full timeline of the HOA's expansion projects over the past decade. It turned out Tibbs had been behind a number of landscape enhancements that were quietly rerouting easements, converting setbacks into hardscapes, and extending communal areas well past their legal limits. Some of the older board members had resigned over it years ago. Others had been voted out after raising objections. The current board was tight-knit, silent, and suspiciously well-coordinated. And most telling of all, every vote authorizing new construction had been passed by a 3-2 margin. Always the same three in favor. Always Ronald Tibbs at the center. Stephen pointed at one particular entry in a meeting transcript, a green space beautification budget approval from 3 years ago. The project had no receipts, no contractor invoices, and had been paid out in cash from the HOA reserve fund. That's theft, he said, and fraud. Can we prove it, I asked. Not yet, but if we keep pulling threads. So we kept pulling. I requested records from the county building department and uncovered that the HOA had never pulled the required grading permits for the recent excavation work done near the west end of the neighborhood. I drove out there one afternoon and saw it for myself: erosion controls missing tree roots, exposed silt runoff trickling toward the protected streambed. The kind of thing that would earn a federal fine for any construction crew operating without a permit. I took pictures, flagged coordinates, and emailed them to Stephen. That same night, I received a visit, not from a board member, from a man I didn't recognize, mid-40s beard, heavyset, wearing a generic brown work jacket. He didn't park in front of my property. He pulled off the road and walked up on foot. I was sitting on the tailgate of my truck when I heard the crunch of gravel. "You Lawson?" he asked. "Who's asking?" He shrugged. "Just someone who worked on that trail job last year." I stood up, and I heard you're asking questions. Figured I'd save you some time. I narrowed my eyes. "You looking to make a deal?" "I'm looking to sleep better at night." He pulled a folded manila envelope from his coat. "These are copies of the emails Tibbs sent us. He knew we were cutting past the boundary, told us not to worry about permits, said he'd handle it." I took the envelope, keeping my other hand near the utility knife in my back pocket. "Why bring it to me?" "Because you're not wrong. And I'm not the only one who's tired of pretending." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows like a man unburdening himself. Inside the envelope were 6 printed emails, all dated within a 2-month window. Every one of them had Ronald Tibbs's name on it. In one, he explicitly stated, "The land's been idle for years. No one from BLM is going to care. Just move the grading line west by 15 feet. We'll handle objections later." That was all Stephen needed. He brought in the BLM's legal team. 2 days later, a formal complaint was filed in district court against Hollow Creek Estates HOA for unauthorized use and destruction of federally protected land. The civil penalties alone could reach into the hundreds of thousands. Criminal charges were on the table. That same week, the HOA's monthly newsletter vanished. The neighborhood website was taken offline. And residents once silent started to whisper in the open. I got more visitors in 3 days than I had in the past 3 years. Mrs. Calloway brought muffins and asked if I needed help cleaning up. The Millers offered to lend their old camper for me to sleep in while I rebuilt. Jean, the widow with the shed violation, hugged me on my front lawn and told me she'd finally canceled her automatic HOA dues. "You reminded us," she said softly, "that they don't own us." Still, the board tried to fight back. An emergency HOA meeting was called closed door by invitation only. I wasn't invited. But 2 people who were told me what happened. Tibbs exploded in front of the remaining board members. called the federal complaint a smear job, accused me of manipulating government connections, and even tried to rally support for a neighborhood countersuit. But something had changed. Fear had shifted. Power was cracking. Only one board member supported him. The rest stayed silent. The next morning, I found a letter in my mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a woman named Karen McNulty, who had lived in Hollow Creek for 8 years and had just retired from a paralegal job. She wrote, "I've reviewed the HOA charter and bylaws. There are enough violations to challenge Tibbs's presidency and initiate a special election. I've spoken to 15 homeowners. We're ready if you are." I folded the letter, smiled, and looked out at the trees swaying in the wind. They'd used that excavator to tear my house down, hoping I'd fold quietly into the dirt. But I'd done more than dig in. I'd unearthed everything they were trying to bury, and I wasn't nearly done yet. It was a Tuesday morning when the neighborhood woke to the sound of tires on gravel and boots on pavement. Not the usual pickup trucks or garbage haulers, but 3 white SUVs marked with government plates and decals that read U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Land Management. They pulled up in front of the HOA clubhouse like it was a crime scene, because in a way it was. The agents that stepped out didn't look like the bureaucrats HOA board members were used to pushing around. These were field compliance officers, each armed with clipboards, cameras, and the firm confidence of federal enforcement. And leading them, stepping out last, was Stephen. He didn't come to posture. He came to document. They walked the entire perimeter of Parcel 18B, marked every encroachment, photographed every inch of the illegal trail system, and logged coordinates from GPS units. Neighbors came out to watch, some with arms crossed in curiosity, others quietly hopeful. Word had spread fast that the HOA's chokehold was finally being challenged. I stood back just outside the cluster of observers, arms crossed. Stephen caught my eye once and gave a short nod. That was all I needed. Ronald Tibbs emerged from the clubhouse, 20 minutes in, flanked by 2 other board members. He looked more rattled than I'd ever seen him, still clinging to his arrogance like a tattered uniform. But the sheen had worn off. "This is harassment," he declared loudly to no one in particular. "This is private property, and these agents have no jurisdiction here." Stephen turned calm and composed. "Parcel 18B is federally protected land under Title 43, and this board authorized unpermitted development upon it. You have no proof of that." Stephen pulled a sheet from his clipboard. "Here is the satellite analysis. Here are the coordinates. And here," he held up the printed email I'd received from the anonymous contractor, "is written. Instruction from you, Mr. Tibbs, authorizing the encroachment." Tibbs turned white. One of the other agents added, "Failure to comply with remediation will result in a referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office. You have 30 days to remove all structures, lighting, and grading material from Parcel 18B. You can't just threaten legal action." "It's not a threat," Stephen said coldly. "It's a notice of federal enforcement." Tibbs looked like he wanted to say more, but he swallowed it. He knew. Everyone watching knew. The king of Hollow Creek had been dethroned in front of his subjects. That night, HOA residents began quietly pulling their yard signs out of the ground, those little white markers that read, "Proud member of Hollow Creek Estates, OA." The fear had turned, and it was no longer aimed at people like me. It was aimed at him. In the following days, things moved fast. The BLM issued an official cease and desist order for all HOA-sponsored development. Fines began accumulating at $1,200 a day for noncompliance. The county issued a stop work order after realizing that no proper permits had been filed for the beautification projects Tibbs had rammed through. And then the audit hit. Stephen had quietly forwarded HOA financials, what little he could gather from public sources and whistleblowers, to the Office of the Inspector General. And they dug deep. Within a week, questions were raised about the HOA's reserve fund, missing dues, and irregular contracting. A subcontractor admitted to being paid in cash without tax forms. A paper trail led to a private account linked to a shell company that suspiciously resembled Ronald Tibbs's consulting firm. When that news broke, it wasn't me who spread it. It was the local newspaper. The front page headline on Thursday morning read, "Federal investigators probe HOA misconduct at Hollow Creek." It was surreal seeing that stack of papers at the gas station. I bought 5 copies, just to be sure I'd have one for every stage of the story. That same afternoon, I received a voicemail from Tibbs. His voice was flat, tired. "Lawson, I don't know what game you're playing, but you've made enemies. Watch yourself." I didn't reply. Instead, I sent the voicemail to Stephen, who immediately added it to the federal file as a potential intimidation attempt. And just like that, the man who once stood on my porch with a clipboard and a sneer had become the subject of a government investigation, a pariah in the neighborhood he once ruled, and the inevitable headline in a scandal that would ripple far beyond our subdivision. But what mattered most, was what started happening next. People changed. Neighbors who had avoided me began stopping by. The Callaways brought a pot of chili. Jean offered her son's help in clearing debris. The Millers gave me a used generator they weren't using. It wasn't charity, it was restoration. A community slowly waking up from fear. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, and the smell of pine sap filled the air, Stephen stood beside me at the edge of the ruined cabin site. "You know," he said quietly, "I've issued enforcement before. Big projects. Mines, ranches, even municipalities. But this feels personal." "It is," I replied. "Not just for me, for all of them." He nodded. "We filed the full enforcement order. Tibbs is officially under investigation. But they'll try something. They always do." "I know. But now you've got the law on your side." "No," I said, "I've got the truth on my side. The law's just finally catching up." He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You gonna rebuild?" I looked out over the land, the scorched outline where my porch once stood, the place where Mary's rocking chair used to sway in the morning breeze. "Yes," I said. "But not just the house. I was rebuilding everything. The land, the neighborhood, the balance of power. And no excavator in the world could stop that now." It didn't take long for the retaliation to begin. First came the anonymous letters. Slipped under my truck's windshield wipers, tucked into my gate, one even mailed to a P.O. box I hadn't used in years. The handwriting was neat, the tone clipped. "This neighborhood isn't big enough for your kind of noise. If you keep stirring the pot, you'll regret what comes to a boil. Maybe it's time for you to move on for everyone's sake." I read each one and filed them neatly in a folder labeled Backlash, Phase 1. Then came the vandalism. My garden beds were trampled one night, the soil scattered like an afterthought. A week later, someone slashed the tires on my truck, 2 front wheels, surgical and silent. No note, no cameras, just the morning dew clinging to deflated rubber. But the worst came when a brick was hurled through the window of the temporary trailer I was sleeping in. It landed just inches from my bed, shattering glass across the floor. Written on the brick in black permanent marker were 2 words: "Enough, Tom." I didn't even blink. I swept the glass into a bucket, replaced the panel with plywood, and left the brick on the front porch for everyone to see. The message was clear: I was poking the beast, and the beast didn't like being cornered. But they'd miscalculated. I wasn't some rookie protester or retired nobody. I was a man trained to endure pressure, built to withstand siege. The more they pressed, the more I dug in. And I wasn't alone anymore. Karen McNulty, the retired paralegal who'd written me that handwritten letter about challenging Tibbs's leadership, returned with a folder full of HOA bylaws and voting procedures. "We need 35 signatures to initiate a special election," she explained. "We already have 22. Most people are just waiting to see if this is real." "It's real," I said. "And it's time." We went door to door, me, Karen, and 2 other residents brave enough to join us. We knocked, listened, answered questions, and faced more than a few slammed doors. But in each conversation, you could see something breaking loose. A mental chain. A realization. No one had ever challenged the HOA before. Not like this. By week's end, we had 38 signatures. Karen filed the petition with the county clerk's office, and according to the HOA's own charter, the board had no choice but to acknowledge it within 10 days. They stalled, claimed the signatures weren't formatted correctly, argued that several residents were behind on dues and ineligible. But Karen had anticipated this. She mailed a formal rebuttal, citing exact clauses in the HOA charter backed by homeowner affidavits. The election date was set, but the HOA wasn't finished playing dirty. Ronald Tibbs, still clinging to power like a man strapped to a sinking ship, launched a counter-campaign. Glossy mailers began appearing in mailboxes, warning residents that outside agitators were threatening the values of Hollow Creek Estates. He painted me as a federal puppet, claimed my son had weaponized the government against peaceful homeowners. I responded the way I always had, calmly, methodically. I printed copies of the BLM violations, posted them on community bulletin boards, shared the scanned emails from the anonymous contractor, set up an open-air presentation in the park where residents could come and see the evidence for themselves. More than 30 people showed up that Saturday morning. I walked them through the entire story, showed them satellite overlays, federal notices, and HOA bylaws, answered every question without a hint of anger. And for the first time, people clapped. Not for a speech, not for a fight, for truth. But the more ground we gained, the more reckless Tibbs became. 3 days before the election, he filed a temporary restraining order against me, claiming I had created an atmosphere of hostility and threat toward the HOA board. His supporting documents included screenshots from Facebook, out-of-context comments, most not even from me, and a blurry photo of me speaking in the park. I appeared in court that Friday with Karen and 3 neighbors as witnesses. The judge, a gray-haired man with tired eyes and little patience, flipped through the file with mild irritation. "Mr. Tibbs," he said, peering over his glasses, "this looks more like a political maneuver than a genuine safety concern. But, Your Honor, he's undermining the peace. Mr. Tibbs," the judge interrupted you, "oversaw the unauthorized destruction of a man's home without due process. He's within his rights to challenge that." Motion denied. Tibbs didn't look at me as he left the courtroom, but I looked at him, and I saw at the beginning of his fall. A man who had operated unchallenged for too long, finally seeing that his time was up. That night I got one more anonymous letter. "You think winning an election changes anything? This place was built for people like us, not you." This time I didn't file it away. I burned it. Let the smoke rise like a prayer from the fire pit in the yard that used to be my home. They could threaten, vandalize, lie, and spin, but they couldn't unmake the truth. And when the vote came, they would finally hear what this neighborhood really believed in. Not fear, not control, but justice. And its voice would be louder than any excavator. The night before the vote, it rained. Not a soft drizzle, but a full summer downpour, the kind that soaked through your jacket in minutes and turned dirt paths into miniature rivers. I stood on my porch under the awning of the trailer, watching the rain cascade off the roof. Somewhere in the dark, frogs chirped, like they knew something was about to change. And it was. Because tomorrow, for the first time in its history, Hollow Creek Estates would vote not on a budget line or a fence height, but on the leadership of its HOA, and whether it would still be run by fear or by the very people who live there. I didn't sleep much. Neither did Karen. She sent me an email at 2:14 a.m. with the subject line, "All ballots printed. Let's win this thing." I smiled then, leaned back in my chair, eyes closed, heart steady. By 9 a.m., the community center parking lot was already full. People arrived in rain boots and windbreakers, carrying umbrellas and holding manila envelopes. There were no chants, no picket signs, just a quiet energy, like the still before a tide turns. The vote was overseen by a third-party volunteer group. Karen had insisted on it, and the county clerk had approved the request to ensure neutrality. Paper ballots, sealed boxes, a table manned by a high school civics teacher, and 2 retirees who'd never cared for Tibbs, but had never said so aloud until now. Tibbs was there, of course, standing near the main doors with his arms folded, wearing a suit and tie, as if this were a court hearing instead of a community referendum. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't make eye contact. He just stood there glaring like a landlord watching his tenants walk out on him. I handed in my ballot around 10:30. Karen followed me in. Jean from across the street came next, followed by the Millers. By noon, the line stretched down the sidewalk. I saw faces I hadn't seen in years, people who had given up long ago on being heard. But today they showed up, because fear had lost its teeth. When the voting closed at 5 p.m., the results were tallied right there in the community center under watchful eyes. The room was silent as the lead volunteer announced the outcome. By a count of 97 to 26, Ronald Tibbs is removed as president of the Hollow Creek Estates HOA. There was no cheer at first, just stunned silence. Then slowly the sound of clapping, real raw and powerful. Not just for the result, but for the fact that it had happened at all. Tibbs stormed out before the second vote even began, the one to elect his replacement. Karen McNulty was chosen by a near-unanimous show of hands. She gave a short, calm speech about rebuilding trust, re-evaluating bylaws, and conducting a full audit of the HOA's finances. And then, the most poetic part of the whole saga, arrived not from a speech or a vote, but from a flatbed truck pulling into the neighborhood 2 days later. The very same excavator that had been used to destroy my cabin rolled back down Hollow Creek Drive. Only this time, it wasn't here under Tibbs's order. It was here under a federal one. The BLM remediation team had arrived to enforce the cleanup of Parcel 18B. The decorative trail, the illegal lighting, the landscaping stones and benches, all of it had to be removed. And under the conditions of the court-approved settlement, the HOA itself had to foot the bill. So they hired a crew, and the crew brought the machine. I stood by the edge of my property, as it happened, watching the excavator tear into the unauthorized trail just as it had torn into my porch, stone by stone, light post by light post. Only this time, it wasn't an act of destruction. It was justice. Stephen drove up just in time to catch the last of it. He got out, leaned against his truck, and watched in silence. Then he turned to me with that small, dry grin I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "They're using the same model," I noticed. I said. "Bet the HOA got a discount for return service." He chuckled. "You did it." "No," I said. "We did it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a long white envelope. "From the regional director's office," he said, handing it to me. "You've been approved for federal restitution. Since your home was partially on a protected buffer zone, the government's kicking in matching funds for your rebuild. You'll also get a legal settlement from the HOA within 60 days. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The figure inside wasn't huge, but it was enough. Enough to start over. Enough to heal. The following week, I walked the footprint of my old house with a fresh surveyor. We laid new markers, new plans. Karen stopped by with blueprints drawn by her cousin, an architect. Jean brought lemon bread. The Millers donated a second-hand wood stove. Even the contractor who delivered the excavator, apparently unaware of the HOA's original plan, offered to help me pour a new foundation for half price. People cared again. Not just about me, but about each other. That was the real victory. It wasn't about lawsuits or votes or even tearing down Ronald Tibbs. It was about breaking the silence that had allowed the HOA to operate unchecked for so long. It was about reminding people that power doesn't come from a boardroom. It comes from standing your ground even when it's been leveled to rubble. As I watched the last remnants of the illegal trail vanish into the dump truck, I turned to Stephen. "You think I'll ever get over this?" He looked at me with that steady calm I'd always admired. "No," he said, "but you'll build through it." I nodded. That night, for the first time in months, I sat beside the fire pit without looking over my shoulder. The stars blinked above. The wind rustled the trees. And I finally felt it, not just relief, not just pride. It started with one nail. I drove it in myself, bare hands, no gloves. The first plank of cedar went up right where the original porch used to sit, just beneath the spot where Mary used to hang a basket of fuchsia every spring. The wood creaked under the pressure. The smell of fresh sawdust caught in my nose, and for a moment I closed my eyes. She would have loved this. The new house wasn't a replica. I didn't want a replica. I wanted something that remembered the past, but didn't live inside it. A single-story design, open concept, wide windows facing the tree line. A reading nook where the old chimney had once stood. Karen's cousin helped sketch the blueprint, and 3 neighbors volunteered on weekends to help frame the structure. Even Stephen showed up in jeans and a worn t-shirt one Saturday to help lay flooring. It was more than a rebuild, it was a resurrection. And the neighborhood, it changed too. Under Karen's leadership, the HOA underwent what she called a reset. Monthly meetings became open forums. The bylaws were rewritten in plain English. Fines were capped. Enforcement required photographic evidence and board consensus. And most importantly, fear was stripped out of the system. Tibbs resigned fully after the audit revealed discrepancies in reserve funds and kickbacks from prior landscaping contracts. No charges were filed. He lawyered up early, but his influence evaporated like a puddle under midday sun. He sold his house and moved to a gated community 2 towns over. I heard they had an HOA too. Some people left the neighborhood. Maybe they couldn't stand the shift in power, or maybe they just didn't want to be reminded of what had happened. But for everyone that left, someone new arrived: families, retirees, young couples willing to roll up their sleeves and invest in community, not control. The land around my property remained quiet, peaceful. BLM signs were posted clearly now, marking the protected corridor. No one mowed too close anymore. No one dared. Stephen returned to his office, but not before we shared one final breakfast on my new porch. Eggs, bacon, coffee, black, the way his mother used to make it. We didn't talk about the case or the fight. We just sat there, two men who had found their way back to something even stronger than justice. Each other. "I'm proud of you," he said as he packed up to leave. I didn't say anything right away. Just watched the wind move through the trees. Then I turned to him and said, "You came when it mattered. That's what counts." He smiled and drove off. And just like that, the quiet returned. But this time, it wasn't loneliness. It was peace. Weeks passed, then months. Neighbors stopped by, not because they were checking up on me, but because they wanted to. Jean brought her granddaughter over one afternoon to pick wildflowers from the edge of my field. The Millers, bless them, showed up with a flagpole and installed it for me. "You earned this," Harold said with a smile. And every time I looked at it flapping in the breeze, I didn't see a symbol of war or defiance. I saw home. The new house was finished by early fall. On the day I moved in, I walked barefoot across the freshly sanded floors and opened every window. The breeze rolled in, carrying with it the scent of pine and memory. I hung Mary's photo by the new fireplace, not because I needed the reminder, but because she'd been here through it all. She would have told me not to fight, that it wasn't worth the stress, that life's too short. And maybe she would have been right, but she also would have held my hand while I rebuilt. Would have laughed at how crooked the porch steps were. Would have whispered, "You always did swing too hard with the hammer." I miss her. But for the first time since she passed, I didn't feel alone in the missing. This neighborhood, these people, they stood up beside me. Together, we took back something more than a house. We reclaimed our voice. And in doing so, we reminded each other of what community actually means. Not silence. Not fear, but presence. A few days ago, Karen stopped by with a letter. It was from a woman in the next town over, someone who'd read about our case. In the paper. Her HOA had started pulling similar stunts, and she wanted to know how we'd done it, how we'd stood our ground. I wrote her back, carefully, honestly. I told her it wasn't easy, and it sure as hell wasn't fast. But that truth is like water. It finds the cracks. And if you stay still long enough, people will see what's real. That night, as the sun went down over the lake, I stood on the new porch and looked out over the land. It was mine again. Not just by title or deed or line on a map, but because I'd earned it, every inch, every nail, every tear. The excavator tried to take my life apart. But in the wreckage, I found something better than revenge. I found rebirth. And now, every time I hear the wind, I don't think of what I lost. I think of everything I reclaimed. My voice, my home, my peace.